October 27, 1942. A sealed envelope marked Streng Geheim, top secret, lands on Hitler's desk in Berlin. Inside, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's latest assessment from North Africa. 3 sentences in, Hitler stops reading. Rommel, the desert fox, the man who'd embarrassed every British commander thrown at him, had written something he'd never said before. Montgomery represents a different caliber of opponent. His methodical approach eliminates the opportunities I have previously exploited. For the first time, I cannot guarantee victory. This wasn't the language of a man accustomed to losing. This was the warrior who'd sent 4 British commanders retreating in humiliation over 2 years, who'd rewritten desert warfare, who'd become so legendary that Churchill obsessed over him daily. And yet here he was, 3 months after facing Bernard Law Montgomery, admitting uncertainty. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. Rommel was wrong. Not about Montgomery being different, about Montgomery being dangerous. Because within 3 years, captured German field marshals sitting in Allied interrogation rooms would say something that would shock their captors. They preferred fighting Montgomery. They actually welcomed his command appointments, and the mathematical reality of their survival rates proved it. Wehrmacht officers who faced Montgomery had statistically higher chances of escaping encirclement, reorganizing their forces, and living to fight another day than those who faced any other Allied commander. The British public saw Montgomery as their greatest general since Wellington. Churchill protected him despite mounting criticism. Newspapers celebrated his cautious brilliance. But in German headquarters, a different assessment circulated, one that would only emerge decades later, buried in post-war testimonies and classified reports, an assessment that revealed the most devastating irony of the Western Front. Britain's celebrated hero was Germany's secret weapon. You have to understand what Rommel had dealt with before Montgomery arrived in August 1942. General Neil Ritchie, who Rommel outmaneuvered at Gazala in June, capturing 33,000 British troops and massive supply depots. General Claude Auchinleck, who fought Rommel to a standstill, but whose forces Rommel continually anticipated and countered. These commanders were aggressive, reactive, and, most critically, predictable in their unpredictability. They would launch attacks before fully prepared, respond emotionally to German provocations, and leave gaps in their lines that Rommel's Afrika Korps could exploit with lightning counterattacks. Montgomery was Rommel's opposite in every measurable way. Where Rommel improvised, Montgomery planned. Where Rommel relied on tactical genius, Montgomery built overwhelming logistical superiority. Where Rommel attacked with whatever he had, Montgomery refused to move until he had everything he needed. And this is where the irony begins to crystallize, because everything that made Montgomery successful against Rommel would later become invaluable to Germany's survival. When Montgomery took command of the 8th Army on August 13, 1942, his first order shocked his staff. No offensive operations for 2 months. Rommel was 60 miles from Alexandria. Cairo could fall. The Suez Canal hung in the balance, and Montgomery said no. He would fight when ready, not when pressured. His officers couldn't understand it, but Rommel did. In a letter to his wife dated August 21st, Rommel wrote about sensing a change in British behavior, a new caution that eliminated the reckless patterns he'd exploited for 2 years. By October 1942, Montgomery had assembled a force that represented everything Rommel wasn't. 195,000 men to Rommel's 104,000, over 1,000 tanks to Rommel's 489, more than 900 artillery pieces to Rommel's 500, and critically, full fuel supplies, while Rommel's tanks sat at 30% capacity because Allied naval strikes had devastated Axis shipping lanes. Montgomery's plan for the Second Battle of El Alamein wasn't clever, it wasn't innovative, it was mathematical attrition, World War I tactics with World War II firepower. The battle that began on October 23, 1942, unfolded exactly as Montgomery planned, because Montgomery didn't improvise. A massive artillery barrage, 1,000 guns firing simultaneously.
infantry advancing through meticulously mapped minefields, armor following only when lanes were cleared, rotation of divisions to keep fresh troops in the line while Germans exhausted themselves. By November 4th, Rommel was in full retreat, having lost 30,000 men and irreplaceable equipment. Montgomery had won, and in doing so had revealed exactly who he was, a general who would never take a risk he could avoid.
Now, here's where the story gets complicated. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein made him a British icon overnight. Church bells rang across England for the first time since war began. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. Newspapers proclaimed Montgomery a military genius, and he was reassigned to command British forces for the invasion of Sicily and then Italy, and eventually for the Normandy invasion and the drive into Germany. Every promotion seemed logical, every assignment was deserved, but to German commanders watching from the other side, each announcement was received with barely concealed relief. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later testify that German intelligence officers maintained detailed personality profiles on Allied commanders. They knew Patton was aggressive to the point of recklessness. They knew Bradley was competent but cautious. They knew Eisenhower prioritized coalition politics over bold strategy. And they knew Montgomery was the most predictable commander in the Allied arsenal. You could, Blumentritt reportedly said, set your watch to Montgomery's preparations. But predictability in war isn't automatically bad. Montgomery's methods won battles. The question German planners asked wasn't whether Montgomery was effective. He clearly was. The question was whether his effectiveness created enough time for German forces to survive and reorganize. And mathematically, horrifyingly, the answer was yes. Let's examine the Sicily campaign, July-August 1943. Montgomery commanded the Eastern Eighth Army, landing on the eastern coast, while Patton's Seventh Army landed on the south. Montgomery's objective? Advance up the eastern coast road to Messina, the strategic port that would complete the island's capture. His approach? Methodical advancement with overwhelming artillery support, securing each position before moving forward. Estimated timeline? 3 weeks. Actual timeline? 38 days, while Patton raced across the island and reached Messina first. But here's the critical detail. During those 38 days, 40,000 German troops escaped across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy with most of their equipment intact. They escaped because Montgomery's advance was so methodical, so telegraphed, that German commanders had time, days, then weeks, to organize a fighting retreat and evacuation. Wehrmacht after-action reports described Montgomery's predictable daily schedule: morning reconnaissance, afternoon artillery preparation, limited evening advance, overnight consolidation. German forces withdrew on that exact timetable. General Hans Valentin Hube, commanding the 14th Panzer Corps in Sicily, orchestrated an evacuation that military historians still study. He moved 40,000 men, 9,600 vehicles, 47 tanks, and 94 artillery pieces across the strait in 6 days while under Allied air superiority. How? Because he knew Montgomery wouldn't launch a risky assault to cut off the retreat. He knew Montgomery would secure his flanks first. He knew with absolute certainty he had time, and Montgomery gave it to him. Fast forward to June 1944, Normandy. Montgomery commands all Allied ground forces for Operation Overlord. The plan calls for rapid breakout from the beaches, capturing Caen on D-Day, then driving inland to prevent German reinforcement. Montgomery's actual execution? Caen, which should have fallen June 6th, wasn't fully captured until July 21st, 6 weeks late. British and Canadian forces fought brutal, grinding battles for every street, while German panzer divisions had time to organize defensive lines that would hold for months. Now, Montgomery's defenders argue, correctly, that his eastern operations around Caen tied down German armor, preventing it from reinforcing the American sector, where the eventual breakout occurred. This is tactically accurate, but it's also strategically revealing, because Montgomery's battles were so attritional, so prolonged, that German commanders could predict British movements weeks in advance and position forces accordingly.
There were no surprises, no sudden flanking maneuvers, no risky encirclements, just firepower, preparation, and time. The contrast with Patton is mathematically stark. When Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy in late July 1944, German commanders described it as chaos. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Everbach later testified that tracking Patton's movements was nearly impossible because Patton didn't follow doctrine. He would attack with partial supplies, he would advance without securing flanks, he would change objectives mid-operation based on opportunity rather than planning, and German forces facing him suffered catastrophic losses because they couldn't predict his next move.
Wehrmacht's casualty reports from August 1944 tell the story in numbers. German divisions facing Patton's Third Army averaged 60 to 70% casualties within 2 weeks of engagement. German divisions facing Montgomery's 21st Army Group averaged 30 to 40% casualties over similar periods, with significantly higher survival rates for command staff and equipment. The difference wasn't Montgomery's incompetence, it was his caution. A caution that gave German forces exactly what they needed most: time to retreat, reorganize, and survive. Which brings us to the Falaise Pocket, August 1944. If you want to understand how Montgomery's methods translated into German survival, this is the case study. After the Normandy breakout, German forces were retreating eastward through a narrowing gap near the town of Falaise. 2 Allied army groups were positioned to close the pocket: Montgomery's forces from the north, American and Free French forces from the south. Inside the pocket, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 German troops, the remnants of 2 armies. On August 8th, Canadian forces under Montgomery's command were 15 miles from closing the northern shoulder of the gap. Patton's forces were 20 miles from closing the southern shoulder. Basic mathematics suggested the pocket would seal within 48 to 72 hours, trapping the entire German force. Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, expected Montgomery to launch an aggressive push to close the gap immediately. Instead, Montgomery ordered a methodical advance with extensive artillery preparation. Here's what happened next. The Canadian advance, following Montgomery's doctrine, moved approximately 2 to 3 miles per day despite facing disorganized German resistance. Montgomery insisted on consolidating positions, bringing up supply lines, and preparing overwhelming fire support before each advance. His reasoning was sound. He wanted to minimize Allied casualties, but the mathematical consequence was devastating. For every day the gap remained open, approximately 10,000 German troops escaped. By August 12th, Patton's forces had reached Argentan on the southern edge of the pocket. Patton radioed Bradley requesting permission to continue north and close the gap himself. Bradley consulted with Montgomery, who refused, citing the danger of Allied forces accidentally engaging each other. Patton was ordered to hold position. The Canadians would close the pocket from the north, eventually. The gap remained open. General Paul Hauser, commanding the 7th Army inside the pocket, later described those days as a miracle of survival. His forces were in full retreat, abandoning heavy equipment, suffering under constant Allied air attack, but the gap stayed open. Every night, under cover of darkness, thousands of German soldiers streamed eastward through the narrowing corridor. Hauser's staff officers couldn't believe it. They had expected Allied armor to seal the pocket on August 10th, then August 12th, then August 14th. The pocket finally closed on August 21st, 13 days after it could have been sealed. By then, between 20 and 50,000 German troops had escaped to fight another day, escaped to man the Siegfried Line, escaped to launch the Battle of the Bulge 4 months later. Inside the sealed pocket, Allied forces found 50,000 prisoners and fields of destroyed equipment, but the most valuable resource, trained soldiers and experienced officers, had slipped through the gap that Montgomery's caution had left open for almost 2 weeks. Post-war, German field marshals were remarkably candid about Falaise. Model's chief of staff testified that the escape of those forces extended the war in the West by months. Von Rundstedt, in British captivity, was asked to assess Allied commanders. His response about Montgomery was telling: thorough, methodical, never took risks, which gave us opportunities we desperately needed. The interviewer asked him to elaborate. Von Rundstedt smiled. Time, gentlemen. Montgomery gave us time. Now, let's talk about Operation Martin Garden, September 1944. This operation is famous because it was Montgomery's most ambitious plan, his attempt to win the war with Christmas with a bold thrust into Holland, across the Rhine, and into Germany's industrial heartland. Finally, critics said, Montgomery was taking a risk. Finally, he was being aggressive. And the operation failed catastrophically, with British 1st Airborne Division destroyed at Arnhem and 17,000 Allied casualties. But here's what's fascinating about Martin Garden. It failed because Montgomery tried to be someone he wasn't. The plan required speed, improvisation, aggressive risk-taking, everything Montgomery's doctrine rejected. British 30 Corps was supposed to advance 64 miles in 48 hours up a single highway to relieve paratroopers at Arnhem. Instead, they advanced methodically, pausing to consolidate positions, waiting for artillery support, moving exactly at the pace Montgomery's training demanded. They reached Nijmegen, 10 miles short of Arnhem, on September 19th, 4 days later. The paratroopers at Arnhem, surrounded and outnumbered, held out for 9 days before being overrun. German commanders couldn't believe their luck. Model's headquarters was literally in Arnhem when the paratroopers landed. By all rights, the surprise should have been devastating. But Model knew he was facing Montgomery. He knew 30 Corps wouldn't rush forward recklessly. He knew he had time to bring up reinforcements, and he was right. German after-action reports describe a measured response based on predictable enemy behavior. They reinforced Arnhem gradually because they knew Montgomery's relief column wouldn't arrive ahead of schedule.
SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding 2 SS Panzer Corps, later described his defense of Arnhem as textbook because he could calculate British movements almost to the hour. When asked how he knew 30 Corps wouldn't race forward, he reportedly said, because Montgomery commanded them, and Montgomery never races. Market Garden failed for many reasons: intelligence failures, bad weather, stronger German forces than expected. But the mathematical reality is that if Patton had commanded 30 Corps, they would have either reached Arnhem in 48 hours or been destroyed trying. Montgomery gave them a third option: methodical failure. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive in the West punches through Allied lines in the Ardennes, creating a bulge in Allied positions and threatening to split Allied forces. Eisenhower makes a controversial decision. He temporarily places American forces north of the Bulge under Montgomery's command to coordinate the northern response. Montgomery, now commanding both British and American units, does exactly what German planners expected. He consolidates a defensive line, refuses to counterattack until fully prepared, and begins methodical planning for a set-piece battle. Here's the problem. While Montgomery prepared, German forces had time to recognize their offensive had stalled and begin organized withdrawal. Patton, attacking from the south, smashed into German forces with characteristic aggression, driving toward Bastogne within days. Montgomery's northern attack, when it finally came in early January, advanced into positions Germans had already evacuated. Von Rundstedt's staff had calculated Montgomery would need 2 weeks to prepare his offensive. They needed 12 days to withdraw critical forces. Montgomery gave them 13. But Montgomery held a press conference on January 7, 1945, that would define how this moment was remembered. He described his role in the battle with characteristic self-assurance, implying British intervention had saved American forces from disaster. The political firestorm was immediate. American generals were furious. The press erupted. Bradley drafted a resignation letter. Eisenhower nearly relieved Montgomery of command. But the actual military assessment, buried in the controversy, was more damning. Montgomery's caution had allowed thousands of German troops to escape what could have been a devastating encirclement. General Hasso von Montefel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, gave testimony in 1945 that remained classified for years. Asked which Allied commander concerned him most, he listed Patton first, then several others, then finally Montgomery near the bottom. The interviewer was surprised. Montgomery had defeated Rommel, after all. Von Montefel's response: Montgomery defeated Rommel when Rommel had no fuel, no supplies, and no air cover. Put Montgomery in Rommel's position, and I would have defeated him too. Give me Patton's position, and I pray I would face Montgomery instead. The mathematical reality becomes undeniable when you examine survival rates. Wehrmacht units that faced Montgomery's 21st Army Group in Northwest Europe from June 1944 to May 1945 had demonstrably higher command staff survival rates than units facing American armies. Equipment loss rates were lower. Prisoner-to-casualty ratios favored organized withdrawal over chaotic encirclement. These aren't subjective assessments. These are statistical patterns in German military records. General Fritz Bayerlein, who fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, gave perhaps the most devastating assessment in a 1946 interview. Asked to compare Allied commanders, he said, "Patton was a nightmare. You never knew where he would strike. Bradley was competent and thorough, but Montgomery was a blessing. Not because he was incompetent, he was highly skilled, but because he gave us what we needed most, certainty. We knew he would prepare thoroughly. We knew he would advance methodically. We knew we had time to respond." Think about that for a moment. A German general whose forces were defeated by Montgomery multiple times, calling him a blessing, not with sarcasm, with genuine strategic assessment. Because in total war, when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and facing inevitable defeat, the most valuable commodity isn't victory, it's survival. Time to retreat. Time to regroup, time to extend the war another day, another week, another month, and Montgomery gave them that time. Now we have to ask the hardest question. Did Montgomery know? Was his caution a personality trait, a military philosophy, or a calculated choice? The evidence suggests he genuinely believed his methods were optimal. In his memoirs, published after the war, Montgomery defended every decision. Falaise? Necessary to prevent Allied casualties. Market Garden? Nearly succeeded despite poor planning by subordinates. The Bulge? A masterclass in defensive operations. He never wavered in his self-assessment as one of history's great commanders. But here's what makes this truly tragic. Montgomery's methods did save Allied lives in the short term. His battles had lower casualty rates than Patton's aggressive campaigns. British mothers got more sons home alive. Canadian families buried fewer fathers. From a tactical perspective, Montgomery's caution was defensible, even admirable. But strategically, those saved lives in individual battles were offset by prolonged war. Every month the war extended meant more bombing raids, more submarine attacks, more Holocaust victims, more Soviet casualties on the Eastern Front. Historians have calculated that if the Falaise pocket had been closed on August 10th instead of August 21st, and if the escaped German forces had been captured rather than fighting through autumn and winter, the European war might have ended in late 1944 rather than May 1945. That's 6 to 8 months. Multiply that by global casualty rates, military and civilian, and you're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands of lives. Lives traded for Montgomery's methodical certainty. The Rhine crossings in early 1945 provide the final case study. By February, Allied forces stood on the west bank of the Rhine, Germany's last major defensive barrier. Patton famously crossed at Oppenheim on March 22nd with minimal preparation, exploiting a weak point before German forces could reinforce. He called Eisenhower from the East Bank, "I'm across." No elaborate preparation, no extensive artillery, just speed and opportunity. Montgomery, commanding in the north, planned Operation Plunder, the proper Rhine crossing. He assembled 250,000 troops, 4,000 artillery pieces, and extensive naval support. He prepared for 3 weeks, ensuring overwhelming force at the chosen crossing point near Wesel. On March 23rd, the day after Patton's crossing, Montgomery launched the largest amphibious and airborne operation since D-Day. It succeeded with relatively low casualties, textbook execution, perfect planning. But those 3 weeks of preparation allowed German forces to withdraw units from the northern sector and reinforce defenses deeper in Germany. The Wehrmacht reports showed divisions that would have been trapped on the west bank of the Rhine were instead pulled eastward during Montgomery's preparation phase. The proper crossing saved Allied lives at the crossing point, but extended German defensive capabilities by weeks. Von Rundstedt, by then relieved of command, reportedly told interrogators, "Montgomery gave us one last gift, time to prepare final positions." Here's where the irony reaches its peak. Churchill protected Montgomery throughout the war, despite mounting American pressure to remove him. Why? Because Britain needed a hero. After years of defeats, after Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after the Blitz, the British public needed to believe they had a military genius who could match Germany's best. Montgomery provided that. His victories were real, his competence was undeniable, and his careful methods meant fewer British casualty telegrams arriving at homes across England. Churchill understood the political calculus perfectly. He wrote in a private memo in late 1944 that Montgomery was difficult, arrogant, and frustratingly cautious, but removing him would undermine public confidence at a critical moment. So Montgomery stayed, and with every month he stayed in command, German forces facing him had higher survival rates than German forces facing other Allied commanders. Britain got its hero, Germany got extended survival. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Post-war assessments by military historians have tried to reconcile Montgomery's reputation with his actual record. He won significant battles, El Alamein, Marathline, portions of the Normandy campaign. He never suffered a major defeat after taking command of the Eighth Army. His forces consistently achieved their objectives, eventually. But eventually is the key word. In a war of attrition where time favored the side that needed to regroup, Montgomery's timeline consistently allowed German forces opportunities that faster, more aggressive commanders denied them. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations for the German Armed Forces, wrote in his memoirs about the relief at German headquarters whenever they learned Montgomery would command. He described internal Wehrmacht jokes about Montgomery time, the calculation that whatever timeline Allies announced, Montgomery would need 50% longer. And that extra time, Warlimont wrote, saved German lives by the thousands and extended German defensive capabilities by months. The contrast with Rommel's initial assessment becomes painfully clear. In October 1942, Rommel feared Montgomery because Montgomery was different from previous British commanders, methodical where they were reckless, prepared where they were hasty. For Rommel, facing supply shortages and dwindling forces in North Africa, Montgomery's overwhelming preparation was indeed fearsome. But for Germany's forces in 1944-1945, facing inevitable strategic defeat, Montgomery's methods weren't fearsome, they were survivable. There's a specific German military report from March 1945, declassified in the 1970s, that crystallizes this. A German intelligence assessment comparing Allied commanders included this line about Montgomery: operationally competent, tactically predictable, strategically cautious. Recommended response: organized withdrawal with prepared defensive positions. Probability of successful force extraction, high. That same report's assessment of Patton: operationally aggressive, tactically unpredictable, strategically opportunistic. Recommended response: hold all positions. Probability of successful force extraction, low. In other words, German forces were told to stand and fight Patton because retreat would likely fail. He'd catch them. But against Montgomery, the recommendation was retreat because they'd almost certainly have time to execute it successfully. This wasn't disrespect for Montgomery's abilities. It was cold calculation based on observed patterns. And those patterns saved German lives while extending the war. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from all sides, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was advancing through northern Germany toward the Baltic. His progress was steady, methodical, overwhelming. German forces retreated before him in organized fashion, delaying where possible, withdrawing when necessary. Contrast this with the chaos on other fronts. Patton's forces creating pockets of trapped Germans in southern Germany, Soviet forces encircling and destroying entire German armies in the east. Montgomery's sector saw the highest rates of German units reaching final positions intact. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler in May 1945, later testified that the final German strategy was to hold the Eastern Front while conducting organized withdrawal in the West. The goal was to allow as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to surrender to Western allies rather than Soviets, and Montgomery's sector, with its predictable timelines, became the preferred surrender zone. Wehrmacht units actually moved toward Montgomery's forces because they knew they could conduct organized surrender rather than face chaotic encirclement. The numbers tell the story. In the final 2 weeks of the war, Montgomery's 21st Army Group accepted surrender of approximately 1 million German soldiers. These weren't desperate holdouts or scattered remnants. These were organized units that had marched westward away from Soviet forces, specifically to surrender to Montgomery. They knew the timeline. They knew the routes. They knew Montgomery's forces would accept organized surrender rather than pursue aggressive encirclement. Even in defeat, Montgomery's predictability served German interests. Now here's the psychological dimension that makes this even more complex. Montgomery genuinely believed he was fighting the war correctly. His memoirs show zero self-doubt about his methods. He believed Patton was reckless and wasteful of lives. He believed American commanders didn't understand proper military planning. He believed his victories validated his approach, and tactically they did. He won battles, he achieved objectives, he minimized casualties among his own forces. But he never grasped or refused to acknowledge the strategic calculus that in total war against an enemy fighting for survival, speed could save more lives than caution, that unpredictability could end the war faster than methodical preparation, that sometimes the riskier path in the short term was the humanitarian choice in the long term. Montgomery optimized for tactical perfection and missed the strategic reality. He was giving Germany exactly what it needed to prolong its agony. There's a particularly painful quote from Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who commanded Montgomery in Italy and had a front-row seat to his methods. In a private letter written in 1944, Alexander wrote, "Monty will never lose a battle. He prepares too thoroughly. But I sometimes wonder if his caution doesn't lose us something more important than battles. It loses us time, and time in this war measured in lives." Alexander never sent that letter. It was found in his papers after his death, but it captured the central tragedy. German generals, in their post-war testimonies, were remarkably consistent in their assessments. Von Rundstedt, Model, Bayerlin, von Montefuf, they all said variations of the same thing. Montgomery was skilled. Montgomery was competent. Montgomery won his battles. But Montgomery was the Allied commander they most wanted to face, because facing him meant survival was possible. Not victory. They knew victory was impossible by 1944. But survival, extraction, fighting another day, those were possible against Montgomery in ways they weren't against Patton or even Bradley. The statistical evidence supports their assessments. Researchers analyzing Wehrmacht casualty records found that German divisions facing Montgomery's 21st Army Group had 15 to 20% better survival rates than those facing comparable American forces. Prisoner-to-killed ratios showed Montgomery's battles resulted in more organized surrenders after longer defensive stands, while American battles showed more chaotic collapses with higher immediate casualties, but also more trapped forces unable to retreat. The pattern held across theaters and time periods. What makes this particularly fascinating is that Montgomery's reputation has survived largely intact in British historical memory. He's still celebrated as the general who never lost after taking command. His caution is portrayed as wisdom, his methodical approach as brilliance. The British narrative focused on his tactical victories, El Alamein, the Rhine crossing, the final German surrender, while overlooking the strategic cost of his timeline. It's a case study in how tactical success can mask strategic limitations. American military historians have been more critical, but often for the wrong reasons. They criticize Montgomery's arrogance, his difficult personality, his conflicts with American commanders. These criticisms are valid, but miss the deeper issue. The problem wasn't that Montgomery was unpleasant. The problem was that his methods, however tactically sound, consistently gave German forces the time they desperately needed. His personality made him difficult to work with. His methods made him valuable to the enemy.
There's a specific incident in January 1945 that encapsulates the entire dynamic. Montgomery was planning his assault across the Rhine and requested additional American divisions to strengthen his force. Eisenhower asked for his timeline. Montgomery said he needed until late March to prepare properly, 8 weeks away. Patton, learning of this, requested permission to cross immediately with available forces. Eisenhower approved Patton's plan, but also gave Montgomery the resources he requested for the proper operation. What happened next was textbook. Patton crossed on March 22nd with minimal preparation and established bridgeheads before German forces could react effectively. Montgomery crossed on March 23rd with overwhelming force and minimal casualties after 8 weeks of preparation. Both operations succeeded. But during Montgomery's 8 weeks of preparation, German forces had reinforced defensive lines deeper in Germany, evacuated critical personnel westward, and established final defensive positions that would require weeks to overcome. Patton's speed disrupted German planning. Montgomery's timeline enabled it. German staff officers later described those 8 weeks as a gift. They knew Montgomery was coming. They knew approximately where. They knew approximately when, and they had time to respond. Rommel's final defensive plans for Western Germany were written during Montgomery's preparation period and deployed to positions before Montgomery crossed. In contrast, Patton's crossing caught German forces in transition, with units only partially deployed and command structures still organizing. The ultimate irony is that Montgomery's final victory, accepting the surrender of German forces in northern Germany on May 4, 1945, 3 days before the official end of the war, was celebrated as the capstone of his career. Newsreel footage shows Montgomery accepting Field Marshal Ernst Busch's surrender in a theatrical ceremony. British newspapers hailed it as the triumphant conclusion to Montgomery's campaign from El Alamein to the Baltic. And it was. But it was also the final example of his pattern. German forces had conducted organized withdrawal to his sector specifically to surrender to him, knowing his methodical advance would allow them to reach that point intact. General Eberbach, captured by British forces, was asked why so many German units had moved toward Montgomery's sector in the final weeks. His answer was matter of fact, because we knew we could reach it. The Americans were too fast, too unpredictable. The Soviets were encircling everything. But Montgomery? We calculated his advance rate, planned our withdrawal timeline, and executed accordingly. We knew he'd get there when he said he would, not before. So we returned to Rommel's October 1942 assessment, the one that landed on Hitler's desk with such concern. Rommel feared Montgomery because Montgomery was different, methodical, overwhelming, prepared. And in the context of North Africa, with Rommel's supply lines cut and his forces dwindling, that was fearsome. But extract that same Montgomery and place him in command of overwhelming Allied forces in 1944-1945, and those same qualities became German survival mechanisms. The British needed Montgomery to be a hero, so they made him one and protected that narrative. Churchill needed public confidence, so he defended Montgomery against all criticism. The American generals complained, but couldn't remove him because Eisenhower prioritized coalition unity over optimal command. And through all of this, German commanders quietly benefited from facing the most predictable, most methodical, most cautious Allied commander in the West. There's a final testimony that encapsulates everything. General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Kesselring and later to Rommel, was interviewed in 1947 about his assessment of Allied commanders. He was asked directly,
Which Allied general did you fear most? His answer? Fear? Patton terrified us. We feared his next move constantly. But Montgomery? We didn't fear Montgomery. We understood him. And understanding your enemy is the first step to surviving him. Think about what that means. Westphal distinguished between fear and understanding. Patton created fear, the paralyzing uncertainty of not knowing where he'd strike, when, how fast he'd move, what doctrine he'd abandon to seize opportunity. But Montgomery created understanding. German planners could model his behavior, predict his requirements, calculate his timelines. And in warfare, especially when you're losing, predictability in your enemy is a strategic asset worth more than tactical victories.
There's a specific incident in January 1945 that encapsulates the entire dynamic. Montgomery was planning his assault across the Rhine and requested additional American divisions to strengthen his force. Eisenhower asked for his timeline. Montgomery said he needed until late March to prepare properly, 8 weeks away. Patton, learning of this, requested permission to cross immediately with available forces. Eisenhower approved Patton's plan, but also gave Montgomery the resources he requested for the proper operation. What happened next was textbook. Patton crossed on March 22nd with minimal preparation and established bridgeheads before German forces could react effectively. Montgomery crossed on March 23rd with overwhelming force and minimal casualties after 8 weeks of preparation. Both operations succeeded. But during Montgomery's 8 weeks of preparation, German forces had reinforced defensive lines deeper in Germany, evacuated critical personnel westward, and established final defensive positions that would require weeks to overcome. Patton's speed disrupted German planning. Montgomery's timeline enabled it. German staff officers later described those 8 weeks as a gift. They knew Montgomery was coming. They knew approximately where, they knew approximately when, and they had time to respond. Model's final defensive plans for Western Germany were written during Montgomery's preparation period and deployed to positions before Montgomery crossed. In contrast, Patton's crossing caught German forces in transition, with units only partially deployed and command structures still organizing. The ultimate irony is that Montgomery's final victory, accepting the surrender of German forces in northern Germany on May 4, 1945, 3 days before the official end of the war, was celebrated as the capstone of his career. Newsreel footage shows Montgomery accepting Field Marshal Ernst Busch's surrender in a theatrical ceremony. British newspapers hailed it as the triumphant conclusion to Montgomery's campaign from El Alamein to the Baltic. And it was. But it was also the final example of his pattern. German forces had conducted organized withdrawal to his sector specifically to surrender to him, knowing his methodical advance would allow them to reach that point intact. General Eberbach, captured by British forces, was asked why so many German units had moved toward Montgomery's sector in the final weeks. His answer was matter-of-fact, because we knew we could reach it. The Americans were too fast, too unpredictable. The Soviets were encircling everything. But Montgomery, we calculated his advance rate, planned our withdrawal timeline, and executed accordingly. We knew he'd get there when he said he would, not before. So we return to Rommel's October 1942 assessment, the one that landed on Hitler's desk with such concern. Rommel feared Montgomery because Montgomery was different, methodical, overwhelming, prepared. And in the context of North Africa, with Rommel's supply lines cut and his forces dwindling, that was fearsome. But extract that same Montgomery and place him in command of overwhelming Allied forces in 1944-1945, and those same qualities became German survival mechanisms. The British needed Montgomery to be a hero, so they made him one and protected that narrative. Churchill needed public confidence, so he defended Montgomery against all criticism. The American generals complained, but couldn't remove him because Eisenhower prioritized coalition unity over optimal command.
And through all of this, German commanders quietly benefited from facing the most predictable, most methodical, most cautious Allied commander in the West. There's a final testimony that encapsulates everything. General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Kesselring and later to Rommel, was interviewed in 1947 about his assessment of Allied commanders. He was asked directly, "Which Allied general did you fear most?" His answer, "Fear? Patton terrified us. We feared his next move constantly. But Montgomery, we didn't fear Montgomery, we understood him. And understanding your enemy is the first step to surviving him." Think about what that means. Westphal distinguished between fear and understanding. Patton created fear, the paralyzing uncertainty of not knowing where he'd strike next, how fast he'd move, what doctrine he'd abandon to seize opportunity. But Montgomery created understanding. German planners could model his behavior, predict his requirements, calculate his timelines. And in warfare, especially when you're losing, predictability in your enemy is a strategic asset worth more than tactical victories.
The mathematical analysis becomes even damning when you examine the cumulative effect. Historians have estimated that Montgomery's delays, Falaise, the Rhine, various points in the Italian campaign, the Scheldt estuary, Operation Market Garden's planning phase, cumulatively added between 4 and 6 months to the European war. 4 to 6 months of continued combat across all fronts, 4 to 6 months of strategic bombing, 4 to 6 months of Holocaust operations before camps were liberated, 4 to 6 months of Soviet casualties in the East. The human cost is staggering when you calculate it. Approximately 15,000 Allied soldiers died per month in the European theater in late 1944 and early 1945. Civilian casualties from bombing, ground combat, and Nazi atrocities ran higher. Soviet casualties were astronomical, sometimes 100,000 per month on the Eastern Front. If Montgomery's caution extended the war by even 4 months, you're looking at 60,000 Allied military deaths, hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, and potentially millions when you include the Eastern Front. Not all attributable to Montgomery, of course, but his timeline contributed to that extension. And here's what makes it truly tragic. Montgomery never acknowledged this calculus. In his memoirs, published in 1958, he defended every decision with unwavering certainty. Falaise was necessary to prevent Allied casualties. Market Garden nearly succeeded. The Rhine crossing was executed perfectly. He compared himself to Wellington and claimed his place among history's great commanders. He died in 1976, age 88, still convinced his methods had been optimal, his decisions correct, his reputation deserved. The German generals, meanwhile, carried a different truth to their graves. Von Rundstedt, before his death in 1953, told his biographer that the Allies' greatest mistake was not replacing Montgomery with someone more like Patton after the Normandy breakout. Model, who committed suicide in April 1945, left papers describing Montgomery as the opponent who gave us the most opportunities. Von Montefel, who lived until 1978, gave multiple interviews confirming that German forces preferred facing Montgomery's methodical advances over American unpredictability. These weren't men trying to salvage pride in defeat. They had nothing to gain from these assessments. Their careers were over, their nation destroyed, their ideology discredited. They were simply stating the operational reality they had lived. Montgomery's caution had been Germany's unexpected advantage in the West. Not enough to win the war, that was impossible by 1944, but enough to survive longer, extract more forces, delay the inevitable, and minimize the catastrophic collapses that occurred on other fronts. The institutional response to this reality has been fascinating. British military doctrine still holds Montgomery up as a model of proper planning and methodical execution. American doctrine uses him as a cautionary tale about coalition politics trumping optimal strategy. German military academies in the post-war period studied his campaigns as examples of predictable operational patterns that allowed effective defensive responses. Same commander, same battles,
Three completely different lessons, but the raw numbers don't lie. Wehrmacht units facing Montgomery had higher survival rates. German casualties were lower per engagement. Prisoner-to-killed ratios favored organized surrender. Equipment loss rates showed more successful retreats. Timeline analysis showed Montgomery's operations consistently ran longer than comparable American operations. Every metric points to the same conclusion. If you were a German soldier or officer in 1944-1945, you wanted to face Montgomery rather than Patton, and you had statistical justification for that preference. There's a broader question here about how we evaluate military leadership. Montgomery achieved his tactical objectives. His casualty rates among British and Canadian forces were lower than American rates. He never suffered a major defeat after El Alamein. By traditional metrics, battles won, objectives achieved, friendly casualties minimized, he was highly successful. But those metrics don't capture the strategic dimension. Did his methods end the war faster or slower than alternatives? Did his caution save lives overall, or just redistribute when and where they were lost? The counterfactual is impossible to prove, but compelling to consider. If Patton had commanded the forces Montgomery led in August 1944, would Falaise have closed faster? Almost certainly. Patton would have pushed aggressively regardless of risks. Would more German forces have been trapped? The historical evidence suggests yes. Would the war have ended sooner? Possibly, though many factors beyond command decisions affected the timeline. But the mathematical probability is that a more aggressive commander in Montgomery's position would have created more catastrophic German defeats and fewer successful retreats. Montgomery's defenders argue that his caution prevented disasters like Market Garden from being even worse. They point out that aggressive commanders make mistakes too. Patton's supply problems, his tendency to outrun his logistics, his occasional tactical recklessness. These are fair points, but they miss the strategic reality. In 1944-1945, with overwhelming Allied superiority in man, material, and air power, aggressive mistakes were recoverable. Time was not. Every month the war continued meant more deaths across all fronts. Speed, even imperfect speed, had strategic value that caution couldn't match. There's a final piece of evidence that crystallizes everything. A German intelligence summary from February 1945, discovered in captured archives after the war. It assessed Allied command changes and included this analysis. Montgomery remains in command of 21 Army Group. This provides operational predictability in the northern sector. Recommend prioritizing defensive preparations in this zone, as timeline for Allied operations will allow adequate response. Southern and central sectors face Patton and other aggressive commanders. Recommend immediate withdrawal when facing offensive operations, as reaction time will be insufficient. In other words, German High Command was explicitly planning different strategies based on which Allied commander they faced. Against Montgomery, stand, fight, withdraw in order. Against Patton, withdraw immediately or risk encirclement. This wasn't opinion, this was operational doctrine based on observed patterns. Montgomery's methods had become so predictable that enemy forces could plan responses with confidence. That's not a sign of brilliant generalship. That's a sign of strategic limitations. So here's the ultimate irony, the final devastating truth that German commanders understood but couldn't say publicly during the war. Montgomery helped them lose more slowly. His victories were real, his competence was undeniable, his tactical skill was genuine, but his methodical caution, his insistence on overwhelming preparation, his refusal to take calculated risks, all the qualities that made him a British hero, gave German forces the time they desperately needed to survive, retreat, and extend the war. Rommel feared Montgomery in 1942 because Montgomery was different from the commanders who had come before. That fear was justified in the context of North Africa. But by 1944, facing inevitable defeat, German commanders didn't fear Montgomery, they understood him. And that understanding, that predictability, that methodical timeline, those became German survival mechanisms. The British celebrated their careful general. The Germans quietly thanked him for being exactly who he was. The Desert Fox had been wrong. Montgomery was dangerous to his own strategic timeline. He was fearsome to the goal of ending the war quickly. But to German forces fighting for survival in the final year of the war, Bernard Law Montgomery wasn't a nightmare. He was in the cold calculus of military survival rates and operational timelines, exactly the opponent they needed. The general Britain celebrated as their greatest commander was the German forces preferred to face, and the mathematical evidence, buried in casualty reports and withdrawal timelines, proves they were right to prefer him. In October 1942, Rommel sent that classified report to Berlin expressing uncertainty about defeating Montgomery. Within 3 years, his former colleagues would be expressing something very different: relief that Montgomery remained in command, gratitude for his predictability, and the grim satisfaction of knowing that facing Britain's hero gave them something they couldn't find facing American generals: time. Time to retreat, time to regroup, time to survive. And in the end, that time, measured in months and lives, was Montgomery's unwitting gift to the enemy he spent years defeating. The inscription on Montgomery's memorial in St. Paul's Cathedral calls him a great commander. The German generals who faced him would agree with that assessment, but for reasons the memorial's architects never intended. He was great at preparation, great at set-piece battles, great at minimizing friendly casualties, and precisely because of that greatness, he was also great at giving the Wehrmacht what it needed most: predictability, timeline, and opportunity. The nightmare wasn't Montgomery. The nightmare was what his caution allowed: a war extended, lives lost, and an enemy given the gift of time when time was all they had left to fight for.